Welcome to Curvy Woodworking. In this video, I'm going to show you how I put together this custom coat rack. Alright, to get this build started, I got some dimensional sections of beech wood from a barn near our house. It was a pretty good price. It didn't look like the best lumber, but it's definitely something that we can work with to make it look good. We're going to cut this up into sections, and something we realized while we were cutting it up into sections is that the wood started to split under the tension after we cut it, so it kind of looked like a hockey stick after it went through the table saw. Okay, so this is our straight edge jig that we're about to use. Now when I cut the beech wood, it bowed out on either side. There was a lot of tension in that piece. So in order to get a clean edge that I can then joint before I glue it all together, we're gonna clamp it in place over here. We're gonna run the square edge against the table saw guide, and then we're gonna take out that bow and give us a nice straight cut through.
My son does a great job, but a little help.
So now once I smooth out the ridges and I cut this to the proper dimension, I'm going to be sanding this slab for the bench all the way up to 320 grit of sandpaper. Now just remember this one trick. When you're sanding, make sure that you get a pencil and scratch the entire surface, and keep on sanding with each individual grit until that pencil line disappears. That's going to ensure that you have a consistent sand across the entire surface. Now the next step of the build is to make these side panels from the spalted maple. The process for the side panels is going to be fairly similar to the bench. The only difference is I actually had an easier time with the spalted maple. They did not bend as much as the other pieces of beech. There wasn't as much tension in this, and also I chose the spalted maple because of that nice dead grain pattern it had throughout. But besides that, this step is pretty similar to what you just saw with the glue up. So now I'm just repeating the same steps you saw earlier. To make sure that I have an equal panel on each side, I'm going to have to make a template out of a scrap piece of wood. Okay, so for the template I'm going to be using a piece of plywood. The reason is there's layers in there, it's a stable piece, so when I cut it I don't expect any chips to come out or any warping to occur. Now I look like a kindergartner drawing this out on this template. However, I did have a design that I had drawn up in my book, just in case you're wondering why I look like a 2-year-old. Okay, so to make the template I'm going to drill a hole, and I'm going to be using a jigsaw inside that hole. I'm going to cut the rough shape out, then I'm going to take it over to the orbital sander to smooth everything off. I'm going to be using a smaller size just so I can make it smooth. Now that I have the template complete, I'm going to be tracing that image onto the 2 panels I had dimensioned up earlier. Now, when I do this, I want to keep the blade of the jigsaw within 1/8 of an inch of the pencil line mark that I had traced on there. The main reason is how much I want the router to be working. I'm going to be using a top bearing guided router bit so I can perfectly trace the image I have on my template onto these pieces. 1/8 of an inch is the magic number. If you go any larger than that, you're going to be overstraining the machine carelessly, but if you go any less, you're going to find that you might mess up on one area that you can't fix afterwards. So for me, 1/8 of an inch is a magic number whenever I'm working with this template. After I take the first pass through with the template, I'm going to be removing that template, and the portion I just cut out is the new template going forward, so I can plunge the router the remainder of the depth. Just to give the piece a bit more depth, after I'm done tracing these images, I'm going to be using a 45-degree chamfer just to give a little more character to the pieces. Now, to install these side panels onto the bench, I have an existing right angle installation guide from a previous project, and I'm going to be inserting 4-inch leg bolts into the bottom, into the top piece. Now, obviously, this is a little disproportionate based off of the very thin nature and potentially weak nature of this bolted maple. That being said, this is more of a temporary measure. Everything will be locked into place later on when I get that top archway, and a couple more braces I'll throw in there just for good measure. Next step is the top curvature piece. Okay, so the side panels in the bench are complete. I'm now going to turn my attention towards the curvature on top of the coat rack. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, I've made a couple quick shorter videos showing this exact technique with this exact build. Now, if this is new for you, I will give you a rundown of what I am doing. This is called a bent lamination technique for bending wood. So you're going to need a mold, you're going to need multiple thin layers of solid wood, and a glue layer between all of those pieces of wood. Now, you're going to clamp this into the shape that you want, and once those glue layers harden, the shape of the wood will hold, and you're going to have the appearance of a solid wood look. Something important to keep in mind is the thickness of the wood. For me, it'll change for the species of wood, but I tend to keep it to 3/16 of an inch. That's the magic number for me, and what I use for every single project, so that I don't have any bending or breaking occurring when I put this wood in tension. Once I have the same size for the curvatures, I'm then going to cut a tensile steel rod that's going to support it from the inside and hold it in that exact rigid shape. Okay, so to lock these in, I'm going to be placing a pin through the top, and that's going to be embedded into the wood. To cover Now, these decorative pieces are usually the most tedious pieces to do on these type of projects, but they do pay off in the end. So to fasten these pieces onto the curvature section, I'm going to be using a 5-minute epoxy between the rod and the curvature section to both fasten that joint and to fill up the void inside the end bearing cap I created. I'll also be using a carpenter's glue between that bearing and the wood section so I have a solid seal. Okay, now I got the two curved pieces. I need to put a piece in between that'll span the two of them and hold everything in place before I do the glue up into here. So I'm going to show you how I made this curvature piece in between. Now, to hold everything in place, I'll just be using a dowel system. Once I have the carpenter's glue and everything in place, I'll just use a C-clamp to hold the pressure there until the carpenter glue sets overnight. Now, once again, I used dowels in between the side panels and the top curvature. This was a little more difficult than the previous glue up, mainly because every time I had to trace on that template, I had to pick up the curvature, place it on top, and then take it back down. It was pretty risky, but everything did work out okay. Once I get the dowels and the glue placed, I'm going to be using some clamps to hold everything tight together. And before I move on to the legs, I'm going to just sand off the transitions between the two pieces to make it look like it blends into one another. Okay, so now we got the bench, the curvature on top, and the sides all done. I'm going to start to work on the legs. Now for the legs, I want to have solid wood, so I'm going to start to do some glue up. I'm going to make them thick and bulky, and I'm going to be using a mortise and tenon technique to tie them all in together. I'll show you how I do that in the upcoming minutes. Now you're probably sick of watching the same glue up over and over again in this video, but just for your consideration, I made sure to get rid of all of the planing and the cutting to get the pieces to this section that you've seen me do on every other step. So to connect the table legs, I'm going to be using a mortise and a tenon. So I'm going to bulk out the material in the leg, and then I'm going to be putting a tenon on this piece. And I cut that through the table saw. You're about to see how I do that. So now the two pieces are going to slide perfectly into each other, and you can see I have a perfect joint all the way around now. So you can see how I do this process on the table saw. I pretty much set a very simple jig. I just put a block to stop the piece of wood, and that's the furthest extent I want the tenon to reach, and that's going to make sure that on all four sides I have a perfect cut that'll slide perfectly into the leg. Now I just need to draw out the mortise sections I'm going to be installing onto the leg sections. Now there's going to be two different techniques I use over here. What you're going to see first right now is how I cut the back legs. I'm just going to bulk out the material so that a span that's coming across can slide directly in there with no problems. The second technique I'm going to be using is for the front leg. I want to make sure that the grains on the front leg come all the way through. So I'm actually going to be using this mortising bit on the drill press. I set the depth so that I can still have the front of the leg uninterfered. This isn't a perfect technique. As you can imagine, I still have quite a rough bottom that I have to chisel out by hand afterwards. That being said, especially on the front of the leg, to have that consistent grain pattern come all the way through, it's definitely worth the extra work I'm putting into it. This part always stresses me out. This is usually where I find out that I messed up a very stupid calculation and nothing fits together, but through some miracle, everything worked out. On the front span, which was on the right hand side, I'm just going to throw in a little architectural detail, so I'm just going to put a large curvature across the entire face, sand it out, and then I'm going to be putting a chamfer on every single piece, a 45-degree chamfer. Nothing too big. I don't like the rounded look, and I find that the chamfer is more of a modern look for new furniture. Now on the bottom of each leg, I need some adjusters just in case the floor is not even, so I'm going to be countersinking these holes that will be able to accept the adjustable feet afterwards. Now you see that I had the span going across the entire leg section. I want to put a shelf throughout the entire section. So I'm going to be using some corrugated steel that I had left over in the shop. Once I cut it to the proper dimensions, I'm just going to be spray painting it with an oil rubbed bronze spray paint. Okay, so to combine all the legs together, I'm going to be using 2-part epoxy just because I have a little bit of wiggle room in there. I don't want to be using a carpenter's glue because it runs and I'm going to have some voids in there. Epoxy is thicker, it won't run as much, and it's going to set a lot quicker. This is an unforgiving step. I have to make sure that the 5-minute epoxy is both installed very quickly and I don't drip it across the entire surface. Now, dripping it on the surface isn't the end of the world. I can always sand this off afterwards, but especially because of this epoxy, it is difficult to remove. Once I get the middle span epoxied in, I'm going to be installing some 4-inch screws along the top just to fasten it. I don't want to use epoxy where I don't have to. However, with these spans, as I mentioned earlier, I did find it necessary to use. Now the second part was a little more fun to work with. I did cut a slot for that steel grating across the entire perimeter, all the spans and the side pieces, and this was all able to slip together with a mallet and clamps. I was considering installing epoxy in here, however, once I clamped everything together, I couldn't pry it off with my hand, so I decided to leave it as is. Now, once everything is dry fitted together on the mid-level, I'm going to be gluing up the side pieces as well. Now, this is going to take a lot larger clamps, a little more stressful, and there is one caveat to this. Once I get the clamps installed, I need to make sure that there was no movement while I was clamping everything together and that it still fits on the rails I have installed on the underside of the bench section. Okay, now that was a hard glue up. Main reason being, after I put the clamps on, I had to make sure that they could still fit into the flaps I had on the underside of the coat rack and bench I built up to this point. So I had to get straps along the bottom because when I clamped it along the top over here, it kind of kicked out a bit, like 1/8 of an inch. So I got a lot of tension in these two straps in the front and bottom, but now once the epoxy holds, everything will lock into place and it's going to be ready for finish. Now to finish off this coat rack, I'm going to be using a 20% gloss lacquer finish. But before I can put that product on, I have to use a sealer coat to see if there's any hairs that'll stick up from the wood. But the sealer coat is only to make the loose fibers in the wood stand. So it's going to seal the wood, make sure no more moisture penetrates inside there. And now with those fibers sticking up, I'm going to take a 320 grit sandpaper. I'm going to sand off those fibers before I put the costly, more expensive lacquer finish on top. And after I'm complete this coat, the coat rack is officially complete and ready to be delivered to my house. So I've been working on my coat rack for the past month, and I'll give you a quick rundown of how I saw the design in my head at the beginning and how it turned out now. So the top, I wanted to make something related to the civil engineering side of what I do. So I made an archway bridge, and right beneath that, with all these random cutouts, the inspiration was a skeleton bracing design. I'm not sure if you've ever seen the cast where they have only the spots that are in tension or compression, and it looks like a random pattern, but there is some logic behind it. So I want to give that the feel to support the archway bridge above. Lastly, on the bottom, I want to give it that industrial look, so I just used a quick chamfer across the entire surface, and lucky for me, I found a lot of nice grain. So if you take a closer look at all these legs, you'll see a tiger maple pattern throughout the whole thing. So everything all together, now I have 2 rows for a shoe rack. I can hang up my coats. This project is done. Thanks for watching my video on how I put together my custom coat wrap. Now if you did enjoy this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and to hit that alert button. If you do want to see what this looks like in my house, be sure to follow my Instagram page. As soon as I'm able to deliver it, I will be posting some pictures there and the overall setting with all of my other projects tying into each other.
Oh, I didn't record it.